Let's go ahead and find a seat. So thank y'all so much for being here with us today. I'm really excited about this topic, and we have two great speakers who are going to share on raising financially healthy kids, and I'm looking forward to how we can apply stewardship in our own lives as well as starting our kids to practice that. And so who we have with us tonight is Dave Briggs. Dave has been at Central Christian Church of Arizona for 10 years, leading the stewardship ministry on their 6 campuses. Prior to joining the staff at Central, Dave held a similar position at Willow Creek Community Church. In 2002, Dave left a 27-year career as a finance manager with General Electric to follow his passion for teaching biblical principles of handling money. He has a love for teaching and a desire to help train church leaders to establish thriving and sustainable stewardship ministries. Dave and his wife, Debbie, have 2 grown sons, both of whom are in full-time ministry. And then we have Chris Goulard. In 2004, Chris left a successful career in the financial services industry and joined the staff at Saddleback Church as the pastor of financial stewardship. Over the past 18 years, Chris has started and led Saddleback's ministries focusing on discipling people in biblical financial stewardship, including Financial Freedom Workshop, estate planning, financial coaching, Compass, Financial Peace University, and all other financial workshops and curriculum. Now Chris is focusing his efforts on discipling those to whom God has given a surplus and the spiritual gift of giving. He runs the estate planning ministry and Kingdom Builders and loves to talk with people about growing in generosity. Chris is also passionate about helping other churches start and build healthy stewardship ministries and serves as the chairman of the Christian Stewardship Network, which is a network of stewardship pastors and leaders who serve in congregations around the world. Chris and his wife Jennifer have been married for 29 years and have 2 sons that are 22 and 18. He graduated from Dartmouth College in 1989 with a BA in economics, received his CFP designation in 92, and completed seminary in 2006. So let's welcome them for being here with us today, and then I'm going to pray over them as they get started. Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to continue to learn and grow. And Father, I pray for each of us in this room that you would give us tools to practice stewardship with our time and our talents and our treasure. I pray for Dave and Chris as they prepare and get ready to speak to us and teach us. Lord, I just pray that you would come upon them and lead them and guide their words. And Lord, I just pray that you would just transform each of us in this room tonight. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, we appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you tonight on a topic that we are both very, very passionate about. We're passionate about stewardship and parenting. And part of the reason why this particular seminar was put together is we kept hearing over and over again parents saying, I really do want to give my kids a healthy start in the adult world and to give them and equip them to do money right. But then they would say, I don't know where to turn, we don't know how to do this. And so this was the culmination of a long period of study to determine how can we give parents practical strategies and tools to be able to teach their kids at home so that when they're adults, they can rely on what they learned at home and get out into the adult world with a foundation to do money right. And so we call this Raising Financially Healthy Kids. And we're going to walk through a number of different things today that I believe you could actually plug in with your kids immediately, so that we're going to make it very, very practical. But I want to start off by asking a very simple question, and that is, what can you spend your time doing today that'll still matter 50 years from now? If you think about it, most of what we do isn't going to matter by next Tuesday. There are very few things we can do today that'll still matter 50 years from now, but teaching, training, and preparing our kids for life will still matter 50 years from now. And what we teach them, they will then be able to teach their kids someday. and it goes on and on. And that's why we feel so passionate about this topic, because the time we invest in our kids today will have ramifications long after they leave your house. And so that's, again, why we're very passionate about this. And so we're going to start off just making a few general comments before we dive into 8 specific keys to training our kids in this area.
Yeah, and because we have relatively limited time tonight, we're going to cover a lot of topics, some of which, frankly, are very broad topics that you could spend a lot of time talking on. We're going to touch on them, and this is an example of it, kind of a cultural background thing that we could talk about for a little bit, but rather than spending a lot of time on it, we're just going to mention it and move on, recognizing that it's something that you may want to make some notes of or pray about. And our hope would be that this is something that you're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about, praying about, because all of the stuff we're going to talk about today, when you have kids, this is all stuff you can take home and use. I mean, that's the whole idea. It's very practical stuff. But in terms of understanding the practical, we've got to understand the background. So one example is the culture has shifted dramatically. If you think about the culture that your parents grew up in versus the culture you grew up in, what we see today is a huge culture shift. If you were to talk to my dad, what he would say is, when I grew up, my parents prepared me for life. That's what they were all about. Today, when you talk to parents, a lot of them want to keep their kids happy. Very different thing with very different outcomes, okay? So we have to understand that that's going on in the background, and sometimes we're going to be subject to that. And one of the things that we have to think about as parents, doesn't mean, I'm not saying you don't want your kids to be happy, obviously, right? But my job as dad is not to be my kid's friend, it's to be their dad. Okay, and so sometimes that means I want to prepare them, and sometimes that means having boundaries or doing things a little differently than some of the folks around you that you'll see that your kids go to school with or whatever. They may just have a little different viewpoint on that, okay? So let's just kind of leave that one there. But there's 3 groups of people that your kids are predominantly going to learn from. You as the parents, they're going to learn from teachers, and when I say teachers, I mean broadly, not only at school, but here at church. Okay, they're going to have Sunday school teachers or whatever. There's going to be people in their lives that are sort of in a teaching role. And then lastly, there's going to be a group of people in their lives that they're always, the group they spend the most amount of time with, and that's their peers. And when you think about it, they're going to learn from all 3. Ideally, as the parent, you want to have as much control over what they're learning and be able to, pass on values and things like that. So you want to take a very proactive role there. Because if you don't, they're going to rely just on the other 2 areas. The problem is what we've got is sometimes parents are not confident in this, particularly in this financial area, because they don't have tools. So we're going to try and give you some of those. But the other thing is, too, is what we see is there's a cycle that's going on, oftentimes generation to generation. And when I've worked with many, many people over the years and they struggle with financial issues, and when I ask them, how did your parents do with money? They kind of go, well, about the same as me. And so if that's you, it may not be, but if that's you and you kind of think, well, I didn't really learn this stuff as a kid growing up, you have the opportunity to break that cycle and actually raise your kids a little differently and give them some tools and values and maybe habits that will serve them very well as adults and even into their marriage, and hopefully to train their kids as well, right? So you change the cycle. So there's the 3 groups of people that are teaching them, but there's also around them, the culture is constantly going to be pressuring your kids. And we just put a bunch of, I think, recognizable logos up there, where your kids are going to be pressured around spending money on various different things. There's constantly cultural pressure for that, okay? So we need to, as parents, model what it means to be a healthy person and a healthy steward in God's kingdom and the way we handle things, okay? Because if we're not doing that, there's this constant wind, if you will. The culture is constantly pushing us, and if we're not doing it and teaching our kids to push against that, they're going to get swept up in the wind of culture. The culture is just going to take them away because they're getting bombarded with billions and billions of dollars of marketing stuff all the time.
See, and we get our kids first. See, that's the thing. We get them first. And if we don't fill that vacuum of teaching them, then the culture's going to fill it. Culture will fill it. And so we need to take advantage of the fact we get them first, and we get a chance to create the ability for them to resist the impact of the culture. So we're going to be walking through 8 specific keys to raising financially healthy kids. And so we're going to organize this into those 8 sections, and we're going to do a deep dive on some of those, which eventually will give you some very specific things that you can use at home.
Abraham Lincoln once famously said, and you probably know the verse, the way to, because the Bible talks about train up a child in the way he should go, right? Abraham Lincoln said, the way to train a child up in the way he should go is to go there first. And so if we want to be modeling it, we have to live it out. And by the way, let me just say real quick, I know that there's going to be an FPU class starting in January here at the church, and so for those of you who want to dig deeper, we can talk more about that later, but if you want to dig deeper in terms of learning, one of the things that I found of teaching this class over the years is that parents sometimes come in and they go, well, this is really good, I want to know how to model it, but the truth is, I have to get better at this myself. How do I get better? How do I sharpen my own axe in order to be able to live this out in my own family and sort of teach the kids? And there's going to be a lot of opportunities. So that's what Abraham Lincoln said. And
so
go ahead.
If in fact our kids are going to pick up from us what they think is normal, then we have to ask ourselves, is what our kids are picking up from us, is that a positive or is that a negative? There was a very interesting study that was done, and 70% of the parents said teaching my kids at home about money is critical. 70%. Unfortunately, only 28% of those people were actually doing it. So what was created there is this good intentions gap, or sometimes called the guilt gap. 42% of the parents knew they should be doing it, but they weren't doing it. And as Chris said, part of the reason for that is they had neither the confidence nor the tools to be able to do what they knew they should do, but they didn't feel equipped to do that. And so that was the reason why we put this together, was to make sure we can fill that 42% gap so that the parents who know it's important have the ability to be able to take advantage of that.
Dave, I got to say, though, there's a 30% that didn't even think it's important to teach their kids about money, so that's a whole other issue.
Yeah,
but they wouldn't be here tonight, so you all, at least we know you're not in that group because you wouldn't be here, right? Okay, just I had to point that out because you go like, what happened to the other 30%? Okay, so when you're teaching your kids, you got to realize that there's things that are taught and there's things that are caught. If you've heard that before, you can teach your kids things overtly, but they're always watching you, aren't they? I know there's some stuff that and oftentimes not really great stuff that my kids come out when they were little. The filter's not always there, right? And they would come out with stuff, and I'm like, where'd you learn that? And then all of a sudden I realized, oh, they learned that from me, right? So they catch things. They're watching you. So there are things that we're going to overtly want to teach them. That's kind of the stuff that we want them to learn through teaching. But they're going to catch a lot of things, too, by observation and how you live your life, how you do it. So, for example, my boys grew up, and they saw how my wife and I talked about money in the house, and they just observe it. When they see me walking around the house turning off light switches to try and save electricity, oh, Dad's got a thing about that, right? I mean, they know that. So there's stuff so when you teach things, you're going to know, you can teach them skills, right? So skills have to be taught, because for me to actually learn how to do something, if I'm going to teach my son how to budget, he's not going to catch that from seeing me in the corner at my desk doing one. I have to literally sit down with him and teach him how to do it. But the attitudes are caught. So the attitudes about money, how my wife and I react or interact about money, is a big, big deal. Some of you probably are aware that, in surveys about marriages, there are 3 main causes for divorce. Money is the biggest usually. In almost every survey, it's a top cause for divorce. I don't want to get too far off on that one. But the reason for that actually isn't the money, it's the communication. And so couples oftentimes maybe grew up with different systems. And, hey, I learned it this way, and I have an idea of one thing. My wife grew up in a different system and has a different way about how things should be handled, and maybe has a different priority set than I do. And we have to work as a team to figure out how to work together, right? So money is just part of that. It's sometimes where the friction happens, but kids see that. So if you're fighting about money, your kids see that, right? and it can create some unhealthy perceptions and attitudes in your kids' hearts from that as well. Anyone want to add to that?
One of the personal things that I grew up with, my dad was a businessman, and he was really good with money. He was so good with money that we never really had money issues in our family. My mom didn't work, but my dad, provided well. He was good with money. He was what I would say was the perfect role model for me absorbing good attitudes about money. But there's one thing he failed to do. He failed to teach. He kind of thought that because everything's going so well, we'll let the kids be kids. He never sat down and talked to me about insurance and taxes and just normal kinds of things. He just never thought to do that. And I remember with some degree of embarrassment, I was a junior in college before I even knew what a mortgage was. So you cannot equip your kids by doing only one of those two things. The kids need to see the attitudes modeled, and they need to be intentionally taught about those things like insurance and mortgages and taxes and things like that. We've got to do both if our kids are going to be fully equipped.
And by the way, and there's a verse that'll sum that up we'll get to in a second. What you just said is really important because there's a lot of adults who don't feel competent in talking about insurance. So if you've got a 16-year-old who's maybe getting a driver's license, they should understand how car insurance works. But most adults, frankly, don't know very well how car insurance works. They know they got to pay it, right? But they don't understand, what does that mean if I change my deductible? Or, what does all that mean? I've got collision, I've got liability, what are all these things on here? And so learning that yourself and maybe having a conversation with your insurance agent to understand it better could be helpful so that you can then turn around and explain it to your child. So Deuteronomy 6 has some things to say about it. You must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. And what's interesting about that, I'm going to pause right there, the idea of repeating them again and again to your children. Nobody absorbs 100% of what they learn at any given moment. You'll remember only a small fragment of what you hear tonight, which makes me sad as the teacher, okay? But I realize that that's just reality. And so you have to put tools in place to help you remember some of these things. For kids, that may mean repetition, saying it over and over and over, right? Talk to them when you are at home, when you're away on a journey, when you're lying down, and when you're getting up again. The point of this verse, actually, I think, is not just to repeat it, but it's the idea of living it, that it's important to you, that it's something that's built into your everyday life, day in and day out. So if the kids see that it's important to you, it naturally is going to feel important to them, and it's going to be something that they will naturally, put some weight on in their lives.
And you're incorporating it into your normal life. So when you're running to the hardware store, throw your kid in the car with you and have a short discussion while you're in the car, maybe 10 minutes, about something that relates to helping them become more aware of some aspect of finances. Because kids especially don't have the attention spans to say, okay, on Sunday afternoon we're going to sit down and for 4 hours we're going to teach you everything we can possibly teach you. So the wisdom of knowing how kids learn, incorporate these lessons as Chris says, as you live your life, and make small little lessons over and over again that point your kids in the right direction.
And we'll talk about some of those systems tonight, just so you know, we'll about how to incorporate that at different ages.
So key number 2 is prepare your kids to survive in a harsh world. See, we have to understand that the adult financial world is a very dangerous place. And just like we wouldn't send our 21-year-old into battle without going to boot camp first, we cannot afford to send our kids into the adult financial world ill-equipped for the dangers that lurk there. And that's part of the reason why we feel so passionate about this. We've seen way too many kids that graduate from high school and they head off to college and they get completely swallowed up by the financial dangers in the world because they were never equipped. And those kids that were equipped have developed the defenses against the harsh financial world. We cannot let our kids go there unprepared. One of the very interesting questions that I like to pose to parents is, how would you answer the question, what is the difference between a bribe and an incentive? What is the difference between a bribe and an incentive? And as these arrows show, I'll give you a clue, bribes are always bad and incentives are positive. But we have to know the difference between the two, because I think oftentimes if we don't clearly understand the difference between the two, we may misapply them to do more harm than good. So if someone were to come up and ask you, what's the difference between the two, would you be able to formulate an acceptable answer to that? And then would you be able to make sure that you're incorporating incentives with your kids and not doing bribes? So here's a couple of simple definitions. A bribe is when you pay someone to do something they should be doing anyway without being paid. Whereas an incentive is an additional bonus that you give when somebody exceeds normal expectations. Okay? Does that make sense? So I'll give you an example. We do incentives all the time in the business world. If you're a salesman and your quota is 100 units a month and you sell 120 units, then you get a bonus for having exceeded your standard. That is an incentive to sell more, and that's a positive. It's a positive in the working world. It's also a positive with your kids. If your kids are asked to do something at a certain level and they go beyond that, then you are incentivizing excellence and dedication to the job. So as an example, let's say my 12-year-old has been given the task to paint the tool shed in the backyard. And you tell him or her that when you're all done, I'm going to inspect it, and if you haven't missed any spots, there are no paint drops on the ground, then you'll get a 20% bonus. That is incentivizing them to do the work as well and as carefully as possible, and that's a positive. A bribe would be a young mother taking her 5-year-old son with her to the grocery store. All of a sudden, he is pitching a fit right in the middle of aisle 3.
Anybody been there?
And mom says, okay, if you don't scream, I'll buy you a candy bar. Okay? That's a bribe that has taught your son or daughter the best way to get a candy bar is to act out. Because you should have an expectation that your son or daughter should behave in the grocery store without any sort of payment. And so when you're bribing someone, you are essentially teaching them the opposite of what you really want them to do. So we have to avoid bribes. We have to identify when we're bribing and think only in terms of incentives as we avoid the negative and utilize the positive. Does that make sense? Okay, one of the things that perhaps the biggest questions that I've gotten over the years is, what do I do about allowance? Is allowance a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should we do it? Should we not do it? If I do it, how do I do it? And so I want to walk you through a couple of allowance systems that have proven to be incredibly successful and helpful for a lot of families. These are suggestions. You don't have to do it. But I can tell you that after many years of dealing with parents, this particular system has worked out really well. So we're going to talk about two different methods. One of them I call the paycheck method, and the other I call the commission method. Now, the paycheck method models being a salaried employee. So what we want to do with allowance is we want to replicate what happens in the real world as much as we possibly can in our home. Okay? And so if we choose to do allowance, we choose to do allowance for only two reasons. One reason we don't choose to do allowance is because our kids deserve free money. Our kids do not deserve free money because that's not the way we want to train them, because in the adult world, if you sit around waiting for somebody to give you free money, that isn't going to work. So we do not do allowance because our kids deserve free money. We do allowance for two reasons. We do allowance because we need to get money in their hands so they know how to practice with real money. You can't teach handling money if they don't have something to work with. That's one reason. Second reason, and the most important reason, is to tie having money with working and working well. And so the allowance methods have to reinforce those two things while not contributing to this idea of giving your kids free money. The paycheck method, again, would be similar to working at a corporation and getting a fixed paycheck, say every Friday afternoon. Whereas the commission method is like a real estate agent. You sell a house, you get paid. You don't sell a house, you don't get paid. And so both methods are workable. And what you need to do is choose which one of the methods work best with the personality of your particular child. I will say, just from experience over the years, that about 85% of the kids do better with the commission method than the paycheck method. Okay? And so you would have if you had a very motivated child that has no problem getting his or her jobs done without any real pushing, then the paycheck method works pretty well. Most kids, though, are going to do better with the commission method, where they actually get paid per the jobs that they accomplish. But you're going to have to determine that. If you have two different personalities in two kids in your family, you might end up doing commission with one and paycheck with the other. So, with the paycheck method, you're determining what jobs your kids are going to do during the week, and then the predetermined amount of money that they get for doing those jobs is delivered to them, say, on Friday afternoon. So they do the jobs, Friday afternoon they get the paycheck. Next week they do the jobs, Friday afternoon they get the paycheck. Question, if you're doing the paycheck method and we're replicating what happens in the real world, what would you do on Friday if all of the jobs were not done throughout the week? What would happen on Friday when it's payday?
Call them into HR and write them up.
That's one idea. Somebody said you fire your kids, but that probably isn't going to work either. Here's what would surprise a lot of people. You pay them anyway, but then you invoke a non-financial penalty for missing the jobs that weren't done. Because that's exactly what happened in the real world. If your boss, you're working for a corporation, your boss gave you a project and he said, I want the project done by Wednesday, and it wasn't done, and Friday rolled around, you would still get your paycheck. But your boss would call you in and there would be some sort of unpleasant penalty for having missed the project. So what you have to determine is, what are you going to use as penalties that your kids care more about than the money if they don't do their jobs? And it may be understanding in advance that if the jobs aren't done, then you can't go to baseball practice on Saturday morning. And so you don't incur a financial penalty with the paycheck method. Now, a couple of things that are very important for an allowance system to work. You have to have an employment contract, meaning your kids need to know exactly what they have to do to earn their pay, whether it's paycheck or commission. And if it's a commission, which we'll spend more time talking about the commission, each job that they are required to do will have an amount of money assigned to it that's in the contract. The worst thing you can do is surprise kids. So everything is identified ahead of time so they know exactly what their jobs are that they're required to do and how much they earn for each one of those jobs. and exactly what the penalty is if the jobs aren't done. It is very important that you are both patient and consistent, meaning this is the rule, and if you violated the rule, then you're just going to have to live with the consequences. If you're not consistent, then your kids will become frustrated and the system will begin to collapse. But this is also incredibly important. You must pay your kids on time. And just like if you work for a corporation and it's Friday afternoon and the boss comes in and says, you know what, we're a little tight this week, I'll get around to getting you your paycheck maybe Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. You wouldn't accept that, and your kids aren't going to accept it either. So if you expect your kids to live by the contract, then you have to live by your end of the contract, and that's that you get paid when the job is completed, if you're doing the commission method, or on Friday afternoon if you're doing the paycheck method. Now, what that means is you're going to have to create probably a shoebox somewhere that you're going to hide that's going to be the bank of mom and dad. And you're going to have a bunch of cash in there. Nobody but the two of you know where this is, and that's where you go to get the exact amount to pay your kids exactly when they need to be paid. And so you're just going to put a bunch of coins and ones and fives in there so that you always can pay your kids on time. Because if you don't pay your kids on time, they're going to throw it back in your face and say, you didn't pay me, and I didn't do my job, so we're even. And they would be right. Okay? So you got to have a bank of mom and dad. Now, this is very, very important when we're talking about jobs. Every family needs to have 3 different kinds of jobs. First job is mandatory for no pay. And that's just because you're part of our family. And because you're part of our family and we're in the same boat, we're all going to be rowing together. And so you're going to identify very specifically jobs that are in the mandatory for no pay. Now, they're mandatory, meaning there will be punishments, there will be ramifications if you don't do them, but there will be no pay. Okay? Second would be mandatory with fair pay. You have to do this job, but you're going to be paid for this one. And there are a certain list of those jobs that are done that they get fair pay for. So in our particular family, when we were raising our 2 boys, the mandatory with no pay would be things like setting the table, loading the dishwasher, doing things like that, because they're just part of the family. But mandatory with pay would be mowing the lawn. So you have to mow the lawn, but when you mow the lawn, then you get paid $20 or $25 for mowing the lawn, which is a fair pay for what they accomplished. Now, a lot of people say, what does fair pay even mean? Well, fair pay is age appropriate, because you're obviously going to pay older kids more than you would pay younger kids. But people say, well, what kind of standard should I use? So, well, if you want just a top of my head standard, if you were going on vacation and you asked the neighbor boy, who's the same age as your son or daughter, to do that job, what would you pay them minus 20%? Because you're always going to overpay the neighbor. But we don't want to underpay or overpay. If I offered my son $2 to mow the lawn, that would be very discouraging. If I paid him $100 to mow the lawn, he would have no sense of the value of money. So we have to find that sweet spot where it's a fair pay for the age and for the job that was done. Okay? And then the third category is voluntary jobs for additional money if they want to. And so maybe that would be something like weeding mom's garden. Well, that's not your job to weed mom's garden, but if you weed mom's garden, for every bag of weeds you fill up, you can earn $5 or whatever.
It could be an hourly thing too.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this idea that I want to earn extra money, we ought to be giving them the opportunity to earn some extra money if they choose to. Now, when we say they're voluntary, if they choose not to, we can't hold that against them because it's voluntary. The real world sometimes offers overtime. You work 5 days a week. If you want to come in on Saturday, you'll get time and a half. It would be a voluntary job with fair pay, and since it happens in the real world, we want to replicate that same thing in our home. So without necessarily going into too much detail, here's just an example of some of the things that might be part of each one of these categories. So maybe unloading the dishwasher, setting the table, taking out the garbage, keeping their room clean may be part of the mandatory for no pay. Mandatory for fair pay may be mowing the lawn, sweeping the garage, washing the car, vacuuming the carpets perhaps. And then voluntary with fair pay, weeding the garden, painting the house, washing windows, cleaning the bathrooms, whatever. But in your home, you need an appropriate number of jobs in each one of those categories. Okay? Now, following up on that, rules for payment explained in advance. A half-done job gets no pay. A lot of times, if the job was mowing the lawn and they did half of it, I think a lot of times kids say, well, I only got through half, so why don't you pay me half? If your boss gave you a project and you went into him and said, well, I only got half the project done, that would be unacceptable. So it's unacceptable for you to accept a half-done job. A poorly done job gets no pay. A well-done job gets full pay and an intentional praise for having done a good job, which is very important. I am so proud of you. You did a really, really good job on this. And I just want you to know how proud I am of you. That sometimes goes even farther than the full pay.
Well, keep in mind there's an opportunity to teach kids about expectations here too, because as they're getting used to a system like this, a poorly done job, maybe they don't really fully know what a poorly done job looks like in the beginning versus a well done job, right? So there's an opportunity to go back and say, hey, that was a good, you gave that a good try. However, there's a bunch of stuff you didn't get done. Let's go back and finish that up, and then let me inspect it again.
And that's on us if we didn't explain in advance
Right.
what a
You got to
good
think
job
about
is
age,
like.
right?
So here's a perfect example, because this is maybe a little harsh. So let's take the example of washing the car. Let's just say that washing the car is a mandatory job for $10. I'm just picking a number out there. Let's just say it's a mandatory job for $10. Before you pay them, you do an inspection. You walk around the car and you say, you know what? You missed a spot here. The entire back tire here is a mess. You missed that. It's obvious you didn't do this window here. You didn't put your full effort into this. Therefore, I can't pay you for this. However, you have to rewash the car, and when you rewash the car, then I'll give you $5 instead of $10. So they got penalized twice. They had to wash it a second time, and instead of getting the full $10, they only got $5.
Wow, you are a tough guy.
You bet.
Dang.
But what are we preparing our kids for? We're preparing our kids to do things excellently the first time. And so building that philosophy into the allowance system is what makes the allowance system so powerful. Okay, does that make sense? One of the things that we oftentimes quote is, discipline your children while there is hope, otherwise you will ruin their lives. What we fail to realize sometimes is this doesn't mean beat your kids. What this means is make disciples of your kids. Make learners of your kids. Disciple your kids while there is hope, while they're still young, because if we don't, we end up ruining their lives. That's why this stuff is so important.
That's good. Yeah, discipline and disciple actually have the same root. That's why they sound so much alike. There's the same root word there. So the idea of discipline is about correction. It's about guiding, not punishing.
Before we get off of allowance, anybody have any quick question about allowance? I know we threw a lot at you in a quick period of time. Anybody have any questions specifically about allowance? Yeah.
Yes, we're going to get to that when we
Yeah,
get to the budget.
that's in another section.
Yeah, 100%. But
Great
that's
question.
The short answer is yes, but we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great
Ah.
question. Yeah, what
Yeah,
age
really
are we
good.
looking at? You're actually starting each individual kid when you believe they're old enough to fully understand the whole system. And that might be a different age depending on the maturity of your child. But as soon as you believe they're mature enough to understand how the system works, that's when you start it. And you start it with, obviously smaller jobs and things like that, and you work up to more difficult jobs as they get older. But I think kids are mostly capable of doing a lot of what we're going to teach a lot sooner than you may think.
We'll talk about some of that in the budgeting section too.
Yeah.
But we used kind of a hybrid system in my house where we did both, like Dave talked about. You can do commission and salary, right? So we did both. When our kids were really little, we just started with the salary because we wanted to be able to teach our kids about money. So what allowance for a child means is income. So as an adult, we think about income, earning income. As a child, you can't teach them about money if they have no concept for where it comes from, right? I remember my son at one point said to me, because I made some comment about, well, we don't always get to go out to eat because, that's expensive and we only have so much money. And he said, well, Dad, why don't you just go to that machine and go get more? And he was talking about the ATM. Well, he didn't get it. He just saw Dad go to the machine, pull out some bills, and that's like, that's where you get your money, right? He had no sense that, no, I go to work, So they have to learn all these different things, and they're going to pick up things along different ages. But as soon as you feel that they might be able to learn some of these things, start applying them. I think you'd be surprised how quickly kids pick things up. So we started with more the salary with the kids early on, teach them that there were certain things they had to do to be part of the household. As they got older, we started adding in the chores. So we didn't do the chores in terms of the commission chores when they were really little, but as they got older, we did. So I used to do stuff where they would, honestly, I have two boys too, and when they're little, they want to help. And I would be like, oh man, I could do this in 15 minutes. And my wife would go teach him how to do it, let him help. It's going to take me 45 minutes then. But it doesn't matter because then I could bring them along and it would take longer, right? Because you're laughing, right? You've been there, right? You go, if I do it by myself, it's going to take so long. If I bring my kids and they help, it's going to take twice as long and probably make a bigger mess. But that's how they learn, right? So they learn that stuff. So sometimes it's just engaging them in projects and things. But when you're talking about the financial side of it, when they're old enough to begin to learn money, and we'll talk about how they then apply those things once they get the money, right? Now we've talked about income, where it comes from. You got a salary, you've got commission, so now money's coming in. We're going to start talking about more about then what happens with that money in a little bit, right?
I read an article not long ago that 2-year-olds are able to identify corporate logos.
Oh yeah.
And
They can use an iPad.
So you can't start too early once you get to the point where your kids are old enough to understand the system.
Yes. Forever to
That's
do
true.
what?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with the little plastic mower behind you, right?
And kind of what Chris alluded to is it takes hard work and a lot of extra time to have your kids do some of these jobs rather than doing it yourself. But the goal is not to get the job done. The goal is to teach your kids a valuable lesson. And that's what we have to keep in mind, and it's worth the effort that we put in. No other question on allowance? I don't want to get off of it too quickly because it's a big part of it.
This is a big one.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, here's the problem with taking away money for not doing mandatory jobs. There are some kids that say, okay, I don't care. Because some kids are not motivated necessarily at a certain age with money. And so that's why you have to come up with what they care about most that will motivate them not to miss doing their mandatory jobs. And that'll be different for different kids. It may be missing baseball practice, or maybe not being able to go over to their friend's house on Sunday afternoon. Find out what they care most about, and you will fix the problem really quickly. Because money, oftentimes, if they say, okay, don't pay me, I don't care, then you're in a corner. They painted you into a corner. Find out what they most care about, and you'll fix the problem.
But don't confuse the two. In other words, if they're being paid a commission to do a certain thing, don't then take that away from their base salary, so to speak. Okay.
That would be applicable with the paycheck method. So you pay them anyway, but you take away something they care more about for missing the mandatory part. Because that's what happens in the real world.
Well, and you said something really important, too, that sometimes they really don't want more money. And that's, so to me, we didn't introduce commission until later on, because frankly, when your kid's in third grade, what do they want money for? I mean, how much candy can they possibly buy, right? I mean, my boys, that was their big priority. It was like gummy bears or something, like, you know what I mean? And frankly, I didn't want them to have more money, okay? So you got to think through what makes sense. When they're old enough to begin to start saving for something, so I vividly remember when I was a little kid, and I remember wanting a skateboard. And I remember my mom told me, I will match you, whatever money you can save, I'll match you dollar for dollar. So if this, I don't know what the skateboard was way back then, maybe it was $30, right? So I knew how to save $15. Well, I would start doing jobs, right? I was chores. I remember working, can I help the neighbor mow the lawn? Like, I wanted to make that money real quick, you know, that was the idea. So I was motivated to all of a sudden go earn. If the kids have no motivation, then money doesn't actually mean much to them. You can still teach them how to use it, but again, it just age appropriate and child appropriate, because some kids are different. I mean, there's some kids that are like, man, they are on it right away, and other kids, not so much. And so you got to guide them as you see it working and the system working in their lives. Yeah, but that's a great question.
And that's why having the voluntary jobs for additional pay is so important when they're motivated to save for something special. Yep.
What is the danger of giving them allowance that you teach them financial principles and then having the mandatory jobs that don't get paid and not tying them together?
Well, you're tying them together in that the penalty for not doing them is the same. If you don't do any mandatory job, there is a penalty, whether you get paid for it or not. So you're really tying the penalty around mandatory, not around payment. So if the mandatory jobs are not done, they get the penalty. If the mandatory jobs you were going to pay them for are not done, they get the penalty. So it's the mandatory that ties them together. So good question.
Yeah, so the other thing is, too, like we had sort of two categories. There's mandatory no pay and mandatory fair pay. As they get older, my experience was those kind of almost merge together because there's still expectations. So the language that I used in my house around that was, hey, as part of our family, here's our expectation for you. And that's just who we are as a family. We keep our rooms clean. As a family, we expect everybody to participate in putting their dishes away after dinner, or maybe you take turns, or whatever system you have in your house, but that's an expectation. Also, as part of our family, you receive an allowance, right, based on that, because we did use the salary method. It's important to not over-salary the kids, because then they don't really want to do the other stuff as they get older, so that's just another thing that'll balance out later. But to have, so they understood, again, that's part of, you know, it's kind of like as a pastor, if I did a bad job at somebody's wedding, I'm not going to probably get fired for that. If I do a bunch, then maybe, right? Like, but it's the same concept of like teaching them and expectations and just understanding, being a responsible adult, what does that look like? And sort of basically it's an opportunity to teach them responsibility as a kid. So not everything has to be tied to money specifically.
So do what works for your kid and your family.
100%.
And that'll be a little different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, materialism. The Bible has a lot to say about materialism and the idea of, in fact, I would even use the word consumerism. You know, the idea of even going to the Ten Commandments about not coveting. That is a spirit of consumerism or materialism, wanting something that you don't have. So the idea that if worldly possessions become more important than what we would call the more important things, that's where materialism gets out of whack, right? In its extreme, I mean, a materialist is somebody who literally worships stuff, right? Who highly values stuff. That's their priority. Just in the same way, a hedonist is somebody who values pleasure. I mean, you can go down and egotist is somebody who values himself, right? I mean, that's so. But when you're a materialism is somebody who's really putting a high value on things, on stuff. So if we look around today, and we all have a little bit of it, okay, but it's just something we've got to be careful about, and the idea of teaching our kids about the dangers of it. And I think some of that comes out of if your kid sees you as, well, let's just say, if your car is the most important thing in your life, your child will recognize that very quickly. If, as mom, you have the fanciest handbag and you got to be ahead of all the other ladies because you got that special brand handbag, I wouldn't even know what it is, your kids are going to catch on to that, right? So I'm just sort of picking some examples, but the idea, your kids are definitely going to see this stuff. So at some point, we've got to teach our kids about what does that mean. So we're coming up towards Christmas season. There's different ways to approach this. In our family, we wanted to make sure that Christmas never became about the presents, okay? Now, some of my kids' friends were not Christians. They had a different worldview and a different system. Our kids, we wanted to make sure they understood Christmas is about Jesus. Now, they would get presents, but the presents were not the main thing at Christmas. That was very much secondary to Jesus, okay? So how you talk about those presents and how you even talk about anticipation about Christmas, you got to be really careful not making it about the stuff, right? So it's just those little things sometimes in life that can make a big difference about how you couch that with them. I don't know, you want to cover that one?
Yeah, kids have a weak immune system to viral materialism. There's great confusion between needs and wants. The peer pressure, as we talked about, is intense. Poor financial literacy comes into play, and a dangerous cultural-driven view of normal. Normal today isn't what normal used to be in the past. And as normal moves forward and becomes more and more materialistic and more expensive, the culture just inundates your kids with a new normal. This is one of the more important slides, and I really want you to grab a hold of this concept. There is joy in the tension of limited resources. There's joy in the tension of limited resources. When you can't have it all, you enjoy more what you have. And we rob kids of the joy of overcoming scarcity. There's a joy in overcoming scarcity. Oversaturation will kill joy. And the less kids have, the more they appreciate. Now, in a sense, we understand that. But today's parents and today's society is actually functioning the opposite of what we're talking about here. Chris mentioned earlier, moving from preparing your kids for life to making them happy. And in an attempt to keep our kids happy, we end up, in our society, we end up oversaturating our kids, and they miss out on the joy of overcoming scarcity. Let that sink in, because it's one of the more important principles that I think our society has completely missed. I'll give you just a quick story. When I turned 9, I outgrew my small bicycle. So I went to my parents and said, I think it's time for an adult bike. They said, great, we'll open up a bank account and you can save for your next bike. And it took me 18 months to save for an adult bike. I was riding my mom's old bike from the 30s for 18 months while I was saving money for my bike. But I can remember still to this day, decades later, the incredible joy I had the day I had enough in my bank account to buy my brand new red 3-speed adult bike. I still remember how how incredible that moment was.
Maybe accomplishment.
And I rode that bike for years. I took care of the bike. I loved that bike. Everybody else left their bikes out in the rain, not me. And I can't describe for you how much joy I got out of that bike. Well, I told that story, and when I was teaching back at Willow Creek, I told that story, and one of the guys who actually was in the audience that I knew came up and said, you know, that story really resonated with me that you told 2 weeks ago, because my son is exactly the same age as you were when you got your bike. And you know what I did? Took my kid down to the bike store and I bought him a bike. He left it out in the rain. He didn't take care of it. He didn't get any special joy out of the bike that I bought him. And what struck me more than anything else is I didn't think there was any other way to do it. Because that's what we do. We just buy our kids what they need. But what he said was, in reflecting on my son's experience with his bike, I had robbed my son of the joy of overcoming scarcity. And I think oftentimes in wanting to give our kids the best we have, we end up giving them what is not in their best interest. It may be easier, but it's not in their best interest. And it's almost like if you're, you know, it's a silly example, but if one of your kids came up to you and said, you know, I'd really like to have a puzzle for my birthday. And you give them a completed puzzle. Because we don't want them to have to work through having to put all those puzzle pieces together. How much enjoyment would your son or daughter get out of a completed puzzle? Maybe 5 seconds to look at the picture and say that's cool? Because it isn't the puzzle that brought the joy, it was the process that brought the joy. We need to engage our kids in the process of acquiring what they can enjoy rather than us just give it to them. And if you really let that sink in, I think it'll make a huge difference in terms of how you work with your kids when they desire to acquire something. Does that make sense?
But it can also work actually on the corporate level. Go to the next slide. When you talk about the family system and how do you allow a kid to start to understand things? Now, I'm not suggesting that in third grade, you got to pay the mortgage this month. No, that's not what we're talking about. But as they begin to understand, and we're going to move into more of the idea of budgeting in just a little bit, but as they begin to start taking responsibility for something in the family, depending on the age of the child, it can be something very simple. As they get older, it can become a little bit more complicated. As my boys were growing up, one of the things that we did, and I remember vividly taking a vacation with the kids, where I had some airline miles, and so we could get over to Italy, and we went to Italy, and I rented a car, and we had a very clear discussion with the kids of, like, here's our budget for the vacation. What would you guys like to do while we're there? And what would you like to have, some stuff that Mom and I want to do too, so we get to be part of it. But what's important to you? Is it more activities? Is it food? Is it what would you want to do with our vacation budget? And they got to kind of weigh in on that. We didn't leave it completely up to them in that case, but the idea was they got to manage some of that. So as they're younger, it could be something small. It could be going out to eat, and maybe you say, hey, we have a budget this month of X number of dollars that our family can use to go out to eat together. But we're going to leave you in charge so you get to decide what that looks like this month in terms of going out to eat. So we can go out to a nicer place once, and that'll take the whole budget, or we can go out maybe once a week to a place that's a lot less expensive, right? So they start to learn we can't do everything. And also they have to learn, and this is where the idea that they have to own it and have some responsibility, but you also have to let the consequences sink in a little bit, because if the first week they go, oh, yeah, we're going out to eat, this is my favorite place, and then the budget's done, and then next week they go, let's do that again, and you look in the envelope and you go, no money left. Well, the consequence is we don't get to go out to eat for the rest of the month, right? And you have to let that sink in and let them see that, because that's how they're going to, by living with the ramifications, is where they're going to learn the lesson. And sometimes that's hard. As a parent, if you have really little ones, I had 2 boys. They're both bigger than me now. But when they're little, and this, I'm going to apply this in a totally non-financial way, okay? But with two boys, one of the things that I learned really quickly is they have a lot of energy and they need to be able to do stuff, and boys need to learn how to take risks. And I remember being at a park one day, and my wife and I were there, some other couples, and my boys were climbing up in this tree, and they got pretty high up, and one of the other moms looked at us with horror and said, "How can you let your son do that? What if he falls?" You ever had that moment? Or maybe you've been the other mom, like, "Hey, you shouldn't do that." And I'm not suggesting every parent's going to do exactly the same or whatever, but I remember thinking, okay, so he's going to, skin his arm on the way down. Maybe worst case scenario, he breaks his wrist or something like that, which I don't want to have happen, but he's not going to die. Well, that's his dad thinking. Okay? Well, I'm not suggesting, you put your kids at risk or anything like that, but the idea is that they have to learn, at some point you got to let go of the back of the bike and they got to learn how to ride themselves, right? And maybe they're going to fall a couple times. There's a risk there. They might skin a knee or something like that. And with finances, it's the same thing. Sometimes they have to learn to make mistakes, and they learn what a mistake is because of the pain of that mistake. If we completely coddle and shelter our kids from the pain of mistakes, they'll never learn what that really means. And I got to tell you, it is far better for a kid to learn, gosh, I'm going to skin my knee if I crash my bike, than they've never had anything wrong, and now they're in a car at age 16 and deciding to handle a much, much bigger machine, right? So with money, it's the same thing. If we've never taught them how to manage things, and they can make small mistakes that they learn how to do that, then hopefully that will protect them from making some really big mistakes when they're older or even adults. So it's allowing those consequences to sink in, okay? So as Dave said earlier, praise and be proud of them when they do something well. That's true of anything, right? We do it on the baseball field. Why wouldn't we do it when they're doing something? Maybe it's a chore, or maybe it's just the idea that, they gave their tithe this week. Hey, I'm so glad you did, even though it might be mandatory, like it was in my house, but you still praise them for doing it, right? And then understanding that the ramifications, and sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's hard to watch the kids have to, deal with the consequences. And maybe they miss stuff with their friends or whatever.
And here's what you can't do. You can't shield them from the ramifications of their own bad decisions. Because if you do, they will realize, I can mess up and it's okay, Mom and Dad will cover it. So the hardest thing as parents is when they do mess up, you got to stand back. And you got to let them live with the consequences of their bad decisions. And they'll make better decisions.
All right, so let's get into the budget.
Yeah, we get into the budget. We need to help our kids develop a positive, lifelong habit of budgeting. See, if they can develop a habit of budgeting when they're young, they won't resist it as parents. Studies show that more than 55% of adults don't really have a working budget. If they started as kids, then having a budget would seem normal. A budget does two very important things. It teaches priorities and trade-offs, meaning what are the most important things and what are the least important things. And you can have this or you can have that, but you can't have both. And by having a budget, you begin to realize that you're forcing priorities and trade-offs in their thinking at a very early age. And when you incorporate that into their thinking at an early age, it'll carry over to when they get older.
If you think about what a budget is, by the way, a budget is spending limited resources towards unlimited spending possibilities. There's always more things you can spend on, but you only have a limited amount of budget. And it's teaching kids to understand how to prioritize things. How do you decide what's really important and what you want to do, because you can't do everything, right? That's just reality, frankly, in life. You can't do everything. So let's figure out what are the things that are important and helping them to understand that.
So we're going to talk about a jar or envelope method, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We want kids to learn to write down all of their spending, even at an early age, and then offer a small bonus for having done their budget well. But here's something that we're going to spend just a few minutes on called TV tokens. Now, some people have said TV tokens was worth the price of admission. This is something we incorporated into our family when our kids were like 5 and 8, and it was a brilliant system. What ended up happening is our kids were watching way too much TV. They were just, sitting down, just sitting in front of the TV watching way too much of it. And for us to just yell at them and say, don't watch any more TV or watch less TV wasn't very helpful. So we instituted TV tokens. On Sunday night, every Sunday night, both our boys got 10 tokens. And each token would represent 30 minutes of TV. And they could spend their tokens whenever they wanted on pre-approved television programs. But when the tokens were gone, they stopped watching TV until next Sunday. So what ended up happening basically is they had to budget their 10 half-hour programs on their own during the week. And so it was a budgeting of time which taught them how to budget money, but it also meant that we didn't have to monitor the TV watching anymore. And it was absolutely brilliant because they got to decide when they watched TV. Now, there are a couple of things. You couldn't piggyback on your brother's program. So if your brother wanted to watch, he had to go upstairs. You couldn't piggyback on your brother's program. And if it was a program we watched as a family, it was free. So if we wanted to watch a Disney movie together, then that was free. One other thing we implemented that made the system even better is at the end of the week, if you had any tokens left over, we bought them back. And we bought them back for just enough money that they had to decide, do I really want to watch this program or do I want to get the money? So now you're involving more decision making into the process and let them decide whether it was worth the money to watch a particular program. It was such a brilliant system because it's self-administered itself, basically. We have 2 different boys, 2 different personalities. Our youngest son, his tokens were gone like in the first 2 days. And then he'd go the other 5 days without watching TV. He learned after a while that probably wasn't the best way to go. But our older son, he's thinking, wait a second, if I don't watch TV, I'm going to be a rich man. So he quit watching TV. And what he did is he went into his room, he closed the door, and he read a book instead of watching TV. And that was just what he chose to do, and he got the money for not watching TV. Now, we didn't mind that they were watching TV, but that was his decision. And so he read a book instead of watching TV. Now, he's 42 years old, and he's authored 10 books already. And I think a lot of it had to do with him picking up a love of books instead of watching TV. Well, we have since changed the name to e-tokens because they work terrific for video games, for internet usage, for anything your kid is spending too much time on that needs to be controlled.
Yeah, gaming.
Gaming, whatever. So we're calling them electronic tokens. And the system is so beautiful because it administers itself. You don't have to yell at your kids. You just say, okay, this is how many tokens you get for how many hours you get to do this particular activity. And they get to choose when and where. And buying them back at the end of the week was so brilliant because it then factored in every time I watch a program, it's going to cost me something. Do I really want to spend that money that way? So, like I say, people have been using this system for years as a result of teaching it, and they come back afterwards and say, TV tokens or e-tokens changed our family. And so...
That's good. And that's another area, by the way. You could, let's say they misbehave or you could say, oh, I'm sorry, you've lost a token.
Well,
she asked, how much money would you give back for a token?
First of all, it's age dependent.
Yep.
And what you have to do is you have to find that middle ground where if we said, okay, each token you get a nickel, they wouldn't do it. If we said each token you get $25, the TV would never go on. So what you have to do is find that middle ground where they're thinking, oh man, should I watch this program or should I spend an hour in gaming or not? And it's going to be age dependent because every year we increased what we bought it back for as they got older because we wanted to find that sweet spot where it was a tough decision for them. And I think that's going to be different in every every kid and every age. But that's what you're really looking for, is that middle ground where it's a tough decision for them.
It's almost like you can think, if a token's a half an hour, what's that half an hour worth to the kid? Like, how much in their mind is that worth? And again, you got to watch it, but.
So that, I tell you, people have come back and said TV tokens revolutionized our family, and it did for us too. It really
The other thing
did.
that's kind of cool about it, I had my younger son is a gamer. He loves, and it was always hard to get him off.
Yeah.
But instead of me saying, get off the game, get off the game, get off the game, now it's like if something happens and I'm taking away a token, I'm not making the game the bad guy. It's now his ability to spend it wherever he wants, right? So it's not me against the game anymore. Oh, Dad, you just think games, you don't like games, or it's not that. It's, no, here's how much you have, and
The system
boom, you just lost
provides
half an hour.
defense. Do you have a question?
How early do you suggest starting?
Great question.
And then the other question is, if you've got kids that are a little bit older, middle school, age group, a little bit older, how do you start it and become gut?
Oh, that's
Well,
two good questions.
Those are really good questions. I think it depends on the personality of your kid too. If you really felt your kid would fight it and would feel like you're punishing them, it might not be worth it. But if they said, okay, I can live with that, because of the fact that you're going to buy them back, they may see it to positive. I think for older kids, it would be personality specific whether they would be willing to work with the system. As far as your first question, I would implement this as soon as they're old enough to understand how the system works. So if your 4-year-old, 5-year-old understands how the system works, boom.
Yep.
I would definitely do that. Okay, the jar method, some of you are very familiar with this. I recommend as early as your kids can understand this as well, that whenever they earn money, my recommendation is 3 jars, 10, 20, and 70. 70 would be what they're allowed to spend. 20 for saving, just because they need to get in a habit for saving. And I like the fact in 10% so they get the idea of a tithe early on. Certainly they could give more than this, but I like the idea of at a very early age getting them very comfortable with the first 10% goes to God, and then they get to spend the 70. And so every time they earn money from their allowance, you have to go to the bank of mom and dad, so you're not paying them $1, you're giving them the change fit in these denominations, and then you watch them actually put their money into the budget. And they would stay with the jars until they get old enough to switch to envelopes. And an envelope system gets more complicated in that now you've got church giving, you've got short-term savings, gifts for others, God fund giving, which would be giving to ministries and places other than a church, long-term savings, and then free spending. These are just my recommended percentages. I like gifts for others because there's a certain point in time at which a gift is only a gift if it costs you something. They should have some skin in the game for gifts for others. And then, you can adjust with them these percentages, but essentially this is how you migrate off of the jar to a more complicated system. And as they get older, you simply add more envelopes.
Let me point out something real quick about the jars too. For little kids, this is really important because it's tactile. Little kids learn from seeing and being physical. A first grader doesn't understand the difference maybe between a dime and a nickel, right? Well, the nickel's better, right? Because it's bigger. Nope, right? They got to understand how it works. So the idea of how money works, what does it mean, touching it, they're very kind of visual, tactile. So the idea of putting something in a jar is almost rewarding in and of itself to collect something in a jar. So it's don't skip that part of it. I mean, not that you would necessarily take a kindergarten to the envelopes right away, but the jars are kind of fun because they can see it and they can actually see the savings build up in it too.
Yeah.
It's a very visual thing.
Well, and also one other thing is for this God fund, we matched that. So whenever one of our kids put $1 in there, we matched it. But it also meant that we had some supervision over where they spent that as well. And then we did the same thing. We did some matching on long-term savings. And long-term savings different from short-term savings. Short-term savings is, I want to go to a concert in 2 months. Long-term savings is I want to buy golf clubs that might take me a year, to save for. And then once the long-term savings gets to be a certain amount, then they would open a bank account and take some of that and put it actually in a bank so that they get the opportunity to see how
And
a
learn
bank
that.
works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. A very, very important part of the envelope system is on the back of every envelope, they have to write down the date, money in, money out, the balance, and the description of what the money either was used for or how the money was generated. So they're keeping a running total of everything that's in the envelope. I also love the idea of a reward when you do a surprise audit and the money in the envelope exactly matches the balance, then they get a bonus for really good accounting. And so a surprise audit, we go on a Saturday morning and say, okay, let me see your spending envelope. And you look at the back and you look at the number, you count it up. If it matches, boom, you just got a $5 bonus. So again, we're trying to incentivize them to be very careful about money in and money out, which will help them as an adult. They won't be afraid to keep this kind of thing on a larger budget. Okay, teach kids that work is a normal part of life. Stress work as a good thing, and work equals pay. We talked a little bit about this before, but it's really important that your kids understand that work is not a punishment, work is a good thing. So you want to pick it up from here?
Well, you go back to the Garden of Eden. Work was part of the plan before the fall. A lot of people don't realize that. God's plan for us, the original perfect plan for us before sin, was to work the garden. So work is a good thing. It's important for kids to understand that work is good. When they're little, they're so sweet. I forget who said it about the lawnmower. I remember my son. He had a plastic. He would follow me around in the yard and mow behind me. They want to work. They want to do what mom and dad do. They want to learn. And so that's great. Let them do it. But as they get older, instead of being a negative thing, but when it comes to the allowance, you want to make sure that you always have a list of jobs available in the house. If they want to earn more money and you have nothing for them to do, that doesn't help anybody. Okay? Second thing, so keep it on the refrigerator or wherever you want to keep it. And then Dave did this. With my older son, didn't have to. He loved to read, but I know a lot of families who will say, hey, if for every, as they get older, it might be for every book you read over the summer, I'm going to give you so much money. So for little kids, and it's got to be an age-appropriate book, you know what I'm saying? For a sixth grader, C-Spot Run isn't going to cut it. But an appropriate age book, and if they read it, you set some goals and whatever works for them. But you could actually create a financial incentive to learn.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is incredibly important in conjunction with having a list of jobs on the refrigerator is, let's just say it's Friday afternoon and your 14-year-old daughter says, oh, I just got a call, my friends are all going out for pizza, can I borrow $15? You know what the answer is? No. You know why? Because the jobs have been on the refrigerator all week long, and the fact that you don't have money is not my fault, it's your fault. So let's not let that happen again. But we have the tendency to say, oh, I'm so sorry, here's $15. What have we taught our son or daughter? That we're really not serious about this stuff.
And by the way, fast forward, what does that look like for a 23-year-old who just graduated from college? Oh, my friends are going out, I don't have the money, but I'll put it on my credit card, no problem. Right? That's a behavior pattern that they've now learned and now applying into adulthood.
Absolutely right. So, when kids want money, send them to the refrigerator, not to your wallet. And you may want to actually put that up on the bathroom mirror or something, because that's exactly where parenting is hard, when you have to hold your ground and say, you know what, sweetie? I really want you to go out with your friends. But the fact that you don't have money is not my fault. Don't let it happen again. And that's going to kill us as parents to say that. But it's what we're really trying to teach our kids that matters.
So here's 3 verses that are actually fairly self-explanatory. Proverbs 22:29 says, do you see people skilled in their work? They will work for kings, not for ordinary people. Proverbs 12:24 says, hard workers will become leaders, but those who are lazy will become slaves. And then last, Proverbs 13:4, the lazy will not get what they want, but those who work hard will. And let me just tell you, as somebody who's hired and fired a lot of people over the years, I will take somebody with a hard work ethic over somebody who's intelligent any day of the week. Now, I want both. Let me just be really clear. But, I mean, I like intelligent people too, but hard work will break through almost anything. If somebody's intelligent and lazy, they're worthless. Okay.
Why don't you
Oh, yeah,
take this
I
one?
love this one, and we don't have a lot of time, but I want to hit it. I'm gonna refer back to the jars. In my family, and I understand, I grew up not understanding a Christian worldview. That's not the household I grew up in, so I was never taught about tithing or anything. So when we did the jars in my house, my kids grew up with what we called, instead of 10-10-80, they grew up with 20-20-60. You give 20, you save 20, and you live on 60. And the idea was, I found it so hard when I was first taught about tithing after becoming a believer, because I was already making pretty good income in my 20s, and I was like, I'm not doing that. Are you kidding me? Like, it was a heart issue, not a math issue, frankly. I just thought that was crazy. So my thinking was, if my kids grow up doing 20, then 10's easy. So far it's working. Okay? So I just thought, and what we did was, by the way, of the 20, 10%, that goes to your local church, that's a tithe. The other 10% can go to any charity, like a Christian charity that you want to go to. And as Dave said, you can match or you can do whatever you want with that. But the idea of partnering with kids is really important. Now you'll see this little picture right here. One of the things I know your church is doing as you get closer to Christmas is going to be the Christmas boxes. Okay? And I remember doing that with my kids. And it was an incredible time to work with the kids, because we could then go to Walmart or Target or something like that, and they had the other 10%, not the tithe, that went to the church. The other 10%, they could actually spend that at Target or Walmart. They got to decide what this other kid was going to get, and they got to shop for it and put it in the box. What an incredible experience for a kid to be able to do. Now, you might supplement the box and say, hey, mom and dad want to put in some things too. We'll do it as a family, so you can buy some things, we'll buy some things, and we'll bless somebody, a kid in another part of the world with this box, right? What an incredible, again, very tactile opportunity for a small child to understand generosity and the idea of caring for somebody else that they've never even met. I just think that's a great, many ways to do it, but...
If my wife was here and you were to ask her what is the most important thing she would want you to know about, she would say this: one of the greatest gifts you can give your child is to help them develop an attitude of appreciation and gratefulness. Kids who grow up with appreciation as a core value will be significantly happier, have deeper relationships, and a healthier attitude toward money. We can teach our kids gratefulness and appreciation, but it requires us to be modeling that and to be talking about that at an early age. And then finally, key 8 is teach your kid that God cares about their money decisions. It's not that you have your money life over here and your God life over here. God, in His Word, talks about money and possession all the time. And we need to use the Bible as a spiritual toolkit, because it really helps in our parenting, such as things like Proverbs 16:8 says, it's better to be poor and right than wealthy and dishonest. Or, whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will thrive. Being respected is more important than having great riches. And one of my favorite ones is, greedy people bring trouble to their families. So if I witness one of my sons being greedy, I can say, come on over here. I want to show you what God thinks about greed. Let's look at Proverbs 15:27. What does it say? Greedy people bring trouble to their families. We don't want trouble in our family. Therefore, your display of greediness is something we cannot allow to have happen. And so we're teaching alongside of God's Word, and that is just an additional toolkit that we use when we're teaching our kids. So we're going to bring this thing in for a landing right on time, so we have some closing thoughts. Remember, you are the parent and God holds you responsible for raising your child. Reminds me of a story of a guy who lived in Germany and he'd never been to the United States. He was in his 60s. He finally got a chance to tour the United States, and he was going all around and came back to Germany, and people asked him, well, what did you discover? What did you learn about the U.S.? And his first comment was, I was amazed at how well parents obeyed their children. You are the parent, and God holds you responsible to equip them. Positive impact of a wise no. Comfortable saying no to your kids. Your efforts will pay off. It's not making kids happy, as we talked about before. It's preparing them for life. The goal, to live healthy, God-honoring lives, to make wise life decisions, and to thrive in a harsh financial world. That is the goal of our parenting. If you do this job well, and here's the good news, your kids will be better stewards of God's money. There will be reduced conflict with your kids. Believe me, this can be an area of conflict. If you get it right, you guys can be on the same page. It reduces a lot of conflict with your kids. It'll be easier for them to honor God. And here's the point. If our kids don't learn it from us, who are they going to learn it from? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably nobody. If you do this job well, you will give them a lifetime gift of skills and confidence in financial matters. And this is a huge one. They will experience significantly less marital conflict with their future spouse. As Chris said earlier, whenever they interview people who've been divorced, the thing that bubbles to the top is we had money problems. They will be prepared to teach their own kids someday, and the lifelong benefits are worthy of our best efforts. So again, as Chris talked before in Deuteronomy, commit ourselves completely to the words of God. Tie them to your hands as a reminder and wear them on your forehead. Teach them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're away on a journey, when you're lying down, and when you're getting up again. It's never too late to be the parents your kids need most. Anything else you want to add?
I guess the only, we've covered, I feel like I'm just sort of reflecting on the last hour and a half, and I feel like we've covered a lot of tactical good stuff, but I don't want to miss the foundation of everything, and that is what we want to raise is good stewards. You're not a steward if you still think you own everything. We have to recognize that what we have is from God and belongs to God, and we're just managers of that. And the more we can teach our kids that, the easier, frankly, all these other things become, both for them and for us. And it's never too late, and it's also never too early to teach the kids things. And I'll give you a quick example because I know you maybe have a couple announcements, and but as we close, I'm just going to tell a quick story. Like my son, when he was there, I did. You were okay. Thank you. Gotcha. Okay. And so come on up, because I'm going to finish in one sec. But when my son was in 5th grade, I remember him coming home from school one day, and he said, I want to get a new pair of jeans. And it was a certain brand, which I couldn't even tell you what it is anymore, but I was like, I never even heard of that. I'm just not used to that kind of brand. My wife looked at me, and she's like, I got the look. Like, I knew, like, oh, boy, this is going to be trouble. And I go, how much is one of those? She goes, oh, it's like $150 a pair. And I'm like, So he's 5th grade, but his friend had got a pair, and so he thought instantly that's cool, right? So I said, all right, we're doing a budget. And my wife looked at me, and he's 5th grade, and I go, here's the deal. And we kind of mapped it out, and we got together with my son a couple days later, and we said, okay, because we had made some decisions. We said, okay, for the year, now this is September-ish, like, right up, not distant from what it is this time of year now. And we said, okay, for the rest of the school year, you have $200 to buy all of your clothes, including shoes. Now, at his age, he was going through a pair of shoes because he's a skateboarder and stuff, and he was going through them a lot. And so we said, look, if you want to go buy that pair of jeans, it's $150. You can go get that at Nordstrom. But then you're going to have $50 left for the rest of the year. And if you go to school and your pants are like this by the time, because you're growing a couple inches a year, that's just on you. And he was like, well, where else can I go? And we said, well, let me introduce you to two of our best friends. Their names are Ross and Max. And we went shopping. And he was like, you mean I can get a pair of jeans for 20 bucks? Yeah, 20 bucks at Ross about 3 weeks ago. And he learned, like, wow. And so he learned how to manage that budget in 5th grade. He was doing a clothing budget. One of my wife's friends literally said to her, that is cruel and unusual punishment to let a kid only have $200 in 5th grade. Well, she's not living on a pastor's salary either, so. But he learned, and you know what? He's very responsible with money to this day. And it's just one of those things that we built in. So you just got to figure out what works for you at what time and all that kind of stuff. And you'll have stories, you'll make mistakes, you're not going to do it perfectly, and that's okay. But the idea is, how do I, because you're stewarding your kids, how do I raise my kids and teach them these principles so that as they grow, we continue to build into that, and then, you know, they become a mature adult and can handle finances in a way that maybe you weren't taught by your parents, for example. So,
I know you guys are going to have to pick up your kids, but if anybody does want to swing back and have any questions for us, we're going to hang around here for a while.
You bet.
We'll turn it over to you at this point.
Can we thank Chris and Dave for being here with us? A lot of great stuff. Thank y'all so much. Really appreciate y'all. You know, they talked about generosity, and as they're here, I thought, you know, what are some ways that we can practically do that as a church? And Chris already talked about Operation Christmas Child. That is something that you can pick up this Sunday. The boxes will be available. So if that's something that you want to do, it's a really low way of helping someone in a huge need across the world. And so that's a great way that you can practice generosity as a family. Another thing is that we are partnering with Connie Maxwell. Connie Maxwell's children's home is in Greenwood, South Carolina, and they are a foster care facility. So they have foster care kids there. They have homes that they're in, and I got to visit with them this past week, and I was just blown away about what they're doing and how they're supporting kids and taking care of kids. And so